right, welcome everyone. This is a live conversation with a friend of mine, Patrick Duffley. He's a professor of linguistics here at the university in the city where I live in Quebec City. We've been friends for a few years now, I think, because I come here from time to time, and we met, and when we've been speaking about philosophy for about 2 years, and all of those discussions have been private so far, but we thought that we might as well start recording them and publish at least some of them for you guys. So recently, Patrick and I have been speaking a lot about Christian Neoplatonism, and David Schindler came up. You've probably heard of him if you follow John Vervaeke, because he's been mentioning him for months now. And in particular, I recommended an article about participation, and you also found one about gender and the transcendence of form over matter. And you had some comments, some ideas, some things we could discuss about those.
I really like the two articles, and the part that caught my attention in the first article, I took some notes here, so that's why I'm looking at a paper. That caught my attention was because we've been discussing matter and form, and both of us were a little bit puzzled about the nature of what matter is whether it's pure potentiality. I guess most people out there who are listening to us have heard of matter and form in metaphysics as the two principles of material beings, and as I understood it, it's one of the things you need in order to make sense of change, in which a material being becomes something new. So one of the examples that Aristotle used to use was a lump of bronze that could be made into a statue of Hercules or a statue of Neptune or whatever. The bronze is like the matter, and the form or the shape of Neptune or Hercules is like the form. In the article it touched on participation, but what caught my attention was what he said about matter. Because the first place that I've seen it said is he says it's important to realize that matter is not simply privation, so it's not something negative, purely negative with respect to the form. And I like the argument that he gave for that, is because that would make it into something evil. Right? If it's a pure negation, that's kind of the definition of evil, right? It's negation of something. Something good.
And I also heard John Vervaeke talk about it in terms of multiplicity would be really difficult to explain, maybe impossible to explain, if you were just emanationist. If you only ever talked about forms, if you started your metaphysics like most of the Greeks did with just forms, and then you define God as the form of all forms, or the origin of all the forms, but you give no, let's say, positive kind of existence to matter or to multiplicity, then it's really mysterious to see why things would ever come down from forms, why things would come down from the one, from unity. So the fact that clearly there is multiplicity in the world that exists, we need some other bottom-up kind of principle to explain this multiplicity. And that's why, the idea of creation as being bottom-up and top-down has been coming up in this corner of the internet. But let's say the way that Schindler is able to put it, especially quoting Aquinas, bringing Aquinas into this, was good and clearer than I had seen it before. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about, but it's quite mysterious. Still, I find, to give an argument for it. Of course, if you take it as a starting point, the fact that, okay, well then what we'll do, what Aquinas says is, we'll say that rather than creating just forms, God also creates matter, and the terminus of both form and matter will be in things, in concrete things. So what God creates ultimately is things. He does it through matter and form, but ultimately what he creates is things. And then classically, the difference between, let's say, the Neoplatonists, let's say the pagan Neoplatonists and Aquinas. Aquinas says that God is existence itself. It's not the form of all forms. It's not just the origin of forms, but it is existence itself. And it's not just the forms that exist. There's also matter that exists somehow, positively, but in a non-formal kind of way. Matter has no form. But like let's say if you accept that as a starting point, you can explain like a number of things, and it becomes like it's useful. You see what you can do with it. But I also always find it a bit mysterious. It's like it's so primordial that it's hard to give an argument for it. I see that if you just go the Greek way, then you're gonna have a problem because you can't account for multiplicity. And conversely, if you try to go just the emergent way, like some scientists try to do, then you're not able to account for universals, for the fact that there are real patterns in the world, and you lose your language if you do that. I mean, it's an old Platonic argument. If you deny the fact that there are patterns that really exist and that we have access to those patterns, then it means that your arguments, which use forms, and
universals,
then you're destroying your own arguments. So I mean, you can't even get off the ground. So you can't be just bottom up. Being just bottom up would deny Plato's arguments, so you can't be just bottom up, but you also can't be just top down, because then you can't account for multiplicity. So you have to somehow do both. And like Aquinas is a move that allows him to do that, but still it's so metaphysically primordial, let's say, that it's hard to, let's see, not necessarily get super clear about it, but it's hard to feel super secure. It feels like we're like threading so high. But anyway, Schindler did it pretty well in that article.
Yeah, he defined the kind of mode of activity of matter as being purely receptive.
Yeah.
Right. So it receives the form, and that makes the material a particular kind of material being, right? Which is, and the matter is another thing that caught my attention was how, like, the matter is it's potential, but it can't be pure potential, because otherwise it would be nothing, right? Or sort of that's kind of I've been mystified a bit by that as to like I can see how it's potential in the sense that it has what I would call as a linguist conditional actuality. In other words, it has to be informed by a form in order to become actual. But it can't become just anything, because it's going to give you a material being of some kind. I mean, that's mainly but it's mysterious as to exactly what it is. But I found this idea of a purely it's the form that organizes and determines the matter and makes it this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the matter is part of the story, right? It has to have something. It informs something, right? But that something doesn't have, like I said, the best way I found of understanding was conditional actuality. In other words, it requires the form to be to be.
Yeah. I think I've heard. I don't recall if it's Schindler or Balthasar that I read saying that explicitly. But let's say matter and form only make sense relative to one another. Right. Like you can only ever define them really with one another, because form is what will inform potential, what will inform matter. But conversely, matter is what can be given shape by form. So they only really exist in conjunction one with another.
But what about pure form, like angelic beings, right? They don't have any matter, but I guess they have form, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure how they solved that one exactly, because, or even more than angels, I think. Let's say if you take the Pythagorean theorem, that's an example I like to use. Like abstract, like universals themselves. Like do they exist somehow? It seems to me that they exist even if there was no space and time, they would still exist. So like this seems like it's independent of matter somehow. I'm not sure how they solved that one exactly. I know that the way that some have solved it is interesting. I don't know if you've heard that one. I mean, like, of course, even let's say in the Western tradition, typically we do say that forms exist independent of matter, because they exist in the mind of God, like forms. And we could go through the arguments, but I think it's fairly classic, so I won't go into the details here. So we do say that the forms, the universal, exist in the mind of God. A difference in the way that, definitely Saint Maximus the Confessor, I'm not sure if Balthasar and Schindler would go exactly this way. I know that Balthasar has been really influenced by Saint Maximus, and Schindler really influenced by Balthasar in turn. So maybe they would go that way. But what Saint Maximus says is that the universals, they do exist in the mind of God, but in the mind of God incarnate in Christ specifically. So, like it's deeply connected to matter because of the incarnation. So that's the way they square. That's at least the way that Maximus squares that puzzle, saying that form and matter only exist relative one to another. So you can affirm the existence of universals in eternity, really, because you do it through the incarnation.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite a move.
Blows your mind. Right. You know, I've always, been struck by the fact that the only place where ideas, or you could say forms, can exist is in a mind. Right? I can't imagine. Well, we never find them floating around like as free floating entities or whatever. Like we hold ideas in our mind.
They are also in things too. Like things have form in them, like material things.
Yeah, because things are the materialization of an idea, if you want, or a kind of an incarnation of an idea in the Christian view of things, as I understand it. So you have, so I know that in mathematics there's this debate about like a kind of a Platonist view where these things exist kind of on their own, but I can't conceive. I don't see how you can conceive in a more realistic framework that they could exist anywhere but in a mind of some kind, right? Yeah. So I mean that you see that mathematics points to the existence of a highly intelligent suprahuman mind in a way, right? In that respect, because and as they're incarnated in, which allows you to understand the intelligibility of the universe, right? Because there is something to be understood. There is something intelligible in the thing, or underlying the thing. We can understand it, right? So anyway, the second article is the one that I paid a lot more attention to. I found it really, really interesting. In some of the ideas, the idea of the relation between matter and form that you find in higher forms of life. And Schindler argues that we see here there's a kind of an excess of the form with respect to the matter, such that just one material individual is not sufficient to express everything that's contained in the form, everything that the form holds. And so you get this gives rise to what he calls supra-individuality. So you need more than one individual to express the form, because the form is so high above the matter. So here's how he puts it. I just said a short. The very form that constitutes the individual being transcends that being in its individuality, which is to say that the individual being does not exhaust on its own the full wealth of the form in which it participates. The one form demands a variety of expressions. I found that really interesting. Then he goes into one of the things is reproduction, right, where you have the beings reproduce themselves but not just as kind of photocopies of one another, or like by division or by multiplication, or division, I guess, that gives rise to multiplication, in a way. But by actual sexual difference, right? Giving where you see that, like, one individual is not sufficient to reproduce the species. You need two, which is a sign that the form is it's above the, like, it's higher than the individual matter. Like I was really struck by that. I'd never seen anyone express it kind of explain philosophically or metaphysically the existence of two different sexes within the same species in those terms, right? I found it blew my mind, right? We have something here that's super interesting. Yeah.
And you gave really good examples. I think I understood what he meant when he went through sort of the hierarchy. So for, let's say, simple artifacts, there isn't very much transcendence of the form on the matter. It's always like the same. If you take a cup or some other kind of artifact, like the form is going to shape the matter there, but it sort of ends there. The form doesn't transcend more than that. Whereas when you get to life, even something as simple as vegetative life, then the form is going to start to go outside of the matter to, let's say, go and take some nutrients or some sunlight, or like it's going to interact with things outside of itself to maintain itself.
Right.
So the form is starting to transcend the matter of the thing itself. It becomes even more transcendent when you get to animal kind of life, because then you get to see an important difference in the sexes of like the members of the species. So the species as a whole can only make sense with the two individuals, with the two kinds of individuals that are gonna have relations to produce offspring. So there's a transcendence of the form, not only like the vegetative souls who take things outside of themselves to maintain themselves. I mean, it's going to be even more intense with animals because they literally move and they apprehend things outside of themselves to move and so on. So it's like it's more already than vegetative souls. But with the two genders, it's even more than that, because like each gender will embody the form of that species in a way that is different, but will be complementary with one another and only make sense with the other. So that happens with animals, and is going to be even more intense with animals that require like lots of attention during like child raising. So to pass on the form, it doesn't suffice to like have like a simple sexual relationship. You also need to pass on the form through education of the children. So like you have all of the things that are before and more. Like you still have the vegetative soul ability to take things outside of yourself to maintain your form. You have the animal ability to like consciously go to things and like absorb them to maintain your form.
Appropriate them, right? Yeah.
You also have the sexual differentiation, so that none of the individual member of the species like can exhaust the whole of the species. And not only that, even if you have the two parents, let's say, in the reproductive act, they still don't exhaust the form of the species, because you also need to spend tons of time with the offspring to really carry out that form. Like the form is inexhaustibly linked with relationships between individuals that exhibit that form.
Yeah, it casts a whole new light on bringing up children and education, and how all of that is it's a sign of the it might look kind of like a sign of weakness, like because the differently from the offspring of a deer that's ready to run like a few minutes after like human offspring require this care, but it's actually because you have to bring out, the parents have to bring out the form to its full its full potential. Well, it never gets to absolute, but they have to bring it out to adult form potential, and that takes it takes years, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of care, right? That's I mean, this idea casts light on so many different things.
Yeah.
It's really to me it was a mind opener, right? An eye opener and a mind opener as to. Another thing that I really liked was how he talked about the playoff between unity and difference.
Yeah.
Right. Because on the face of it, you might think that the two they're distinct, right? Unity is one thing and difference is, but he shows that in fact they're not opposed to one another in the higher levels of being, the higher levels of life. If you take like two blocks of marble, a round one and a square one, you put them side by side, right? There's difference, but there's no real unity there, right? But when you put like a male and a female of a living species together, there's difference, but at the same time there's unity. In other words, they're made to complement one another and to allow the perpetuation of the species, right? So you see that, like he says, the person is not just an independent substance, but is characterized by relationality as basically as it is by substance.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big difference from the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
Put much more emphasis on the form, on the essence itself. And it was funny in the article, I thought, when he laid out how Aristotle tried to deal with gender, because Aristotle only has, let's say, essence and matter to make sense of things. He's not able to say that, well, then there's a male form and a female form. There's the form of that species. But then because he's not able to distinguish, let's say, different ways of being the same form via relationships, for instance, then what he ends up having to do is to say that the male is the representative of the form, and it's when the form is defective that you have the female. So it makes sex an accident, but Schindler explains that it's also incoherent, because then you make something that is vital to the species actually accidental to that species. So
it doesn't make too much sense. Right?
And even the way he talks about the accidents, I thought it was quite funny. I didn't know this, but apparently it's a whole theory that Aristotle had, that maleness is related to heat. And it kind of even makes symbolic sense, because the sun is often associated with masculinity, and the night or the moon with femininity, because the sun reflects on the moon, and also the moon comes out at night when things can rest and grow, and that's when the potential comes out, let's say. Whereas the sun is about shining on things, and it can burn things, maleness can go too far. So it kind of makes symbolic sense. I see what he means, but in theory things ended up being funny, because he thought that, let's say, if you want to have, let's say, your cows breed, and you want a male to come out, then they need to do it in a certain direction so that the sun comes out at the right way, so that then you maximize your odds of having male offspring. So it was pretty funny.
Yeah. It turns something really essential into a complete well, it's a defect even, right? It's and you have big problems with the equal dignity of the man and the woman, right? If you have that view of things, right? It's really it's really problematic for a lot of things.
It's related to what we talked about earlier with matter being positive, where for I mean, you can see it there, because for the Greeks, being closer to potential, let's say the female that receives the seed and can then let life emerge, that was seen as something not positive in itself for the Greeks. It's only positive in that it participates to the form, the higher, whereas this wasn't the case in Christianity, because you can affirm the goodness of both heaven and earth, the goodness of the forms and also the goodness of potential. As we discussed, it's harder to talk about potential because it's formless. So it ends up being more mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, we say that there's something positive about materiality, and it's one of the big reasons why. I mean, the Christians were so against the Gnostics, were against the body, but also why the position of women was like so respected in Christianity in opposition to all other cultures, basically, because there's this respect, this for the goodness of potential, for the goodness of matter that you don't see elsewhere, and it comes out like this way in Aristotle too, because for the Greeks it was common to say that goodness comes down, and things can only participate in goodness when they participate in something that's higher, but there's no goodness in multiplicity itself. So it's it's both. The Christian position of affirming that God creates heaven and earth, it sort of solves two kinds of puzzles. There was like the metaphysical puzzle of the one and the many, and there's also the moral problem of affirming the goodness of creation, the goodness of multiplicity, the goodness of potential, the goodness of both genders, that Christianity is able to solve, even though like the axiom is itself is a bit mysterious, as we said earlier, like having to say, well, then God creates both multiplicity and unity. It's a bit mysterious if you accept it, but like all positions have mysteries, but once you accept this one, then you can solve like this metaphysical problem of the one and the many, plus the moral problem of the goodness of concrete things.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I feel a relation there to the Trinity.
Yeah.
Because in God you have both unity and you have oneness and multiplicity.
Yeah.
Right? And the multiplicity is on the level of relations. So it's relationality. So there you get, and you like this, so that the difference between the two sexes is a kind of a reflection of that. He develops that at one point, which I found very interesting as well, that this mysterious bisexuality that we see everywhere in nature, which, like, I've thought of this for a while, like from the point of view of evolution, it doesn't really make any sense at all, because it's a huge complication. In other words, that you have to have, like, both the male and the female have to evolve, they have to remain complementary to one another through all the mutations or whatever, that, like, you've just multiplied the problem of of having something functional. Incredible. I don't know if that, from the evolutionary perspective, that makes any sense at all, but to me it's very mysterious as to why on earth should this have come about by evolution.
Well, I think there too it has to do with the goodness of multiplicity, because I think I've heard evolutionary arguments for the evolution of gender, in that it allows you to generate more multiplicity. Because if it's an individual person in a species, like, you can only add so much genetic variation from generation to generation. So let's say you diminish your evolvability. Like, the species can't evolve as much if you basically just have clones one generation after another.
Right.
But if you have two members of the species who mate, then, like, there are so many more variations that are possible, like when the DNA of the two mix, that you, like, multiply the potential of the species. As you say, it's more likely, let's say, that things can go wrong in the short term, because it's true that, like, as the difference evolves, you need also the unity to evolve as well. Like, it's more complex. You're gonna have more, let's say, short-term failures in the offspring, but also over the long term, it gives you a lot more evolvability for when things actually do change. Because if you're a species that only, like, has clones, then if the environment changes too much, then it's done. Like, you're only, like, you're too pure. You're made, like, for one one domain. But with with multiplicity, you can, like, you have much more room for emergence, let's say. I think it's really tied with what we've been speaking about earlier. Like,
then why not 3 parents or 4 parents or 5 parents? I mean, it would give, for one individual,
that's a good question.
That would give you a lot more
that's a good
adaptability. Right?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I didn't take a lot of time to understand that part of the article, but I recall that I think Schindler explained, using Aristotle, that you actually, like, the maximum difference you can get is always going to be between two, like, two things.
Contraries.
Two contraries. There can only ever be two contraries.
Right.
So it's probably actually related to that if you add and say 3-4 members, you would, I don't know, they wouldn't be as contrary. And because of that, maybe you wouldn't even get as much variability. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I would have to think more about
yeah,
this.
something to think about. Yeah,
Yeah.
But, so relationality, like being a linguist, that struck me.
Yeah.
Because language is all about it's all about communication and entering into relationship with other people, right? And this is something. I mean, one of the ways when we want to punish somebody severely, we put them in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
And you keep them from talking to other people, right? It's one of the the most severe forms of punishment that you can that we can mete out to somebody.
Yeah.
And because you destroy their possibility of entering into relation with other people.
Yeah.
Right. It puts this relationality at another level, right? You see just how important it is for what human beings are, and sort of I find there perhaps an interesting antidote to individualism, right? And the idea that you can kind of be perfectly happy and fulfilled as just taking care of yourself, right, or whatever. But this is it's just not the way that we're built. It's not the way that the world operates either, right? You have this relationality everywhere. It's so like this whole idea of unity and difference, I found that really fascinating. How I think I had another. His conclusion is really. He says that I found it really beautiful. He says real and deep difference is love. Wow. When I read that, I said,
yeah,
this guy, he's on to something really, really like that real and deep difference. Like difference implies relationality. And love is all about relationality, right?
Yeah. I think it brings up the example you brought up earlier where, like, for things to be different, they actually need some kind of unity. Otherwise, like, you can't really gauge if things are alike or not alike. Like comparing apples and oranges,
right?
Like you can't even say that they're different because they're like.
Well, that example, that's a saying, but they're actually both fruit, right?
Yeah.
You can't
say
like
apples and chairs.
Right, apples and chairs would be better.
They're like too different to be different.
Yeah, right. So how would you go about describing the difference there? Because you're not,
They're both things. Like you always have to, you always have to go to the level of reality in which they share to be able to compare things. So like you have to find a level of unity to be able to compare things. So with apples and oranges, you go to the level of fruit. With apples and chairs, you go to the level of artifacts, I guess.
Right.
But with like individuals in a species, then like you can go to the level of like it's going to be male and female or can be different, but still within the same
within the species, right?
Yeah.
It makes me think about how like the classical way of defining something is you have a genus and then a specific difference within that, but you have to have a genus to unite the two things before you so it's always like difference within unity, and both are they're correlative in a way, right? Which is I mean that's also very you're probably familiar with the tradition that stemmed from linguistics of structuralism.
A bit, yeah.
Where it takes a bit of that idea that things are defined by opposition to one another. But again, it's always within, it has to be within a given field or a given semantic field. It can't just be pure difference, right? Which is, and that's another very fruitful idea that I want to think about a little bit more myself, which is like this relationship between unity and difference, and like the difference. It's never just like, I don't know if like modern science is kind of fragmented the way that we see things, right? Because we study, you study hydrogen or whatever, and you focus on that. I mean, which is great. I mean, it gives you very, very useful knowledge, but like a real full view of what hydrogen is, I think would also imply like relations to other things, right?
Yeah. How it fits in,
which is kind of chemistry on some level, right? Because you have it interacting with hydrogen and with oxygen in an interesting way to give something which is essential for life as we know it. But science tends towards fragmentation. And we lose I think we're losing something important there, which is the relations between things, right? And that the universe is it's a fabric of relations between things, right? So things that are different, but that are also united on different levels.
I've thought about this in the past. It seems to be, I do think we see it in science now. But I think it's been a phenomenon in the West for a while, where we've tended to emphasize multiplicity more. And in the East, it seems they had the opposite tendency to emphasize more the unity. So let's see what you think. And I think it started really early, soon after the Europeans converted from paganism. I think you start seeing it. So you have certain heresies that you don't see in the East. Because I think there's I'm not sure why, but there's, let's say, a tendency to look more at matter or at multiplicity. Maybe in the fact that the Europeans were pagans fairly late, whereas, let's say, in the East, the Greeks or the Indians and the Chinese weren't materialists. They tended to be more idealist. So, and they had more sophisticated civilizations than the pagans in Europe. But let's say the last, let's say, place in Europe that was converted to Christianity out of paganism was Germany, or at least one of the last places that was. It came fairly late with Charlemagne, so it was pretty late. And I think a century or two later, you start seeing heresies where people seem to lose sight of the reality of spiritual principles. And so the classic example you have in mind is with, what's he called already? I won't recall the name exactly. I think I'll make a mistake if I try to say it. But there was a German clergy in the 9th or 10th century who started denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, because look at it, it's material. It's a material thing. It can't be. It can't be the body of Christ either. So you had that, and on the other side, you had people who replied materialistically by saying that it's really flesh and blood. It's just hidden, so we don't see it and we don't throw up, basically. So you start already seeing people who, let's say, can't go beyond the material level to the spiritual reality, behind this material manifestation, and of course, this will get patched up temporarily, let's say, especially with Aquinas and transubstantiation. So you have someone really influenced by
Baron Garius, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, Baron Garius. Yeah, he's the guy.
Just came back to me.
Yeah. So Aquinas will patch things up for a while, but still a few centuries later in Germany, people are nominalists again,
right?
And you have Luther, who's going to deny this, deny transubstantiation, but he's going to try to affirm real presence some other way that's not going to hold up, and soon everything has exploded in Europe, starting in Germany. But and they didn't have the same tendency in the East. In the East, they tended to have other problems where, let's say, things were almost too mystical or denied the body too much. So let's say you have the condemnations against origin, these kinds of things. So it looks like both sides have different problems. But I don't think in the West it's been a tendency to, and it's part of what has made even science possible, I think, in the West, that we thought to try to, let's say, set aside higher level principles to look at the mechanics in the lower levels, and it led to like all the material prosperity and wealth that we have around us, but it also like furthered our inability to discern spiritual reality, to look at higher level phenomena. And I think it's breaking down in many ways right now. Like there's been like troubles in the sciences, especially in some of the harder sciences. There hasn't been that much happening in physics, let's say. There's also like this difficulty for us to come together as a civilization. Like we're very fragmented. Like we're individual people doing our own material things, and that's it. We have a difficulty cohering as even just families. We have troubles even just doing that. So, like, all that said, I'm sorry to say that I agree with your point that in science we see like a fragmentation, a tendency to look at the material layer. I think it's a general tendency of the West to look. It's what made science even possible, and then it just compounded. So hopefully it's turning back. We, for instance, with John Vervaeke, with whom I talked several times on this channel, like he raises the point that like his position is fairly mainstream, at least in this branch of cognitive science. There are other sciences where I don't think it is, like in physics, for instance. I think many people are still more materialistically minded, but at least like it seems that we've been materialists for so long that it can't hold on for much longer.
Yeah. No, it's the multiplicity, therefore the fragmentation, and we're losing sight of the unity, right? Which is on a higher level, which is No, I think there's something to that. We're always in a tension between the two, because we're being human beings. We're both. We live in both worlds, right? Which is it's a bit of an uncomfortable place in some ways.
C.S. Lewis called us amphibians.
But it's a fascinating place at the same time, right? Because we get to participate both in the spiritual world and in the material world. You know, we can have a nice glass of beer and enjoy
spiritual discussions.
But it's in human languages very much at that operates at that kind of boundary level as well, because you have an association between a material sign and a non-material meaning. Right. It's very. I was watching something by Schindler the other day, where he's talking about the relation between faith and reason, like how there's a kind of an analogy between the two. One of the points that he made was that all of the words that we use are borrowed meaning they're borrowed from other people, right? We learned them. We didn't invent them ourselves. So there's a kind of faith involved there. In other words, we had to trust other people that they were saying the truth, and that they were. And then within that context, he made another point, which is that once we get the idea, because we're relational, we can't keep it for ourselves. So we immediately need a material sign so that we can communicate that idea to somebody else, right? Which is really, I mean, it's all tied up with language. You see, you see the two, because the only way we can't communicate as pure spirits, we have to communicate through our material side. And so we need the sign, and that's what, as soon as somebody invents, a philosopher or a scientist comes up with a new concept or whatever, they have to find a word for it, because they want to talk about it with the immediate thing you want to do is to share it with other people, right?
That's an interesting example, because in language, what we want to carry out is something spiritual, something invisible, like an idea. But to do that, we will like have to use something material, something at the level of multiplicity of sounds even, like of physical movements, but that's to carry across like one idea or like one thing that's invisible. And it really has to be both, because like even if I say I make certain sounds to you, let's say, it's only because in some sense I'm also, or at least we participate in higher level patterns of intelligibility, that you're able to like see what the sounds are pointing to, let's say. So there's this, let's say, 2-level track that we're involved in, even just when we're speaking.
Oh yeah. Not everything is conveyed by the sound, by the words. There's a lot of what goes into the message is not said. Actually, it's our shared knowledge, shared assumptions, things that we've already talked about, that I expect you to be taking into account in order to interpret what I'm saying, right? And that's going on all the time. It's called pragmatics and linguistics, and it's a big part of communication. And if you don't have that, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but there are people who study people who have autism, and one of the problems that these people have is they don't get the pragmatic side of things. And so it makes it difficult for them to communicate with other people, because they don't get all this stuff that's not actually said, and they tend to be very literal and very that makes for huge difficulties in communicating with other people. You have to share a lot to be able to have a conversation, even on simple things like have a conversation like this. You have to share maybe even more. But it's certainly that's part of the thing. I was listening to something. Did you just see the interview of Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson? Yeah. I haven't watched all of it, but I saw a couple of clips. At one point, he was talking about culture as being all these shared assumptions that are absolutely necessary for us to live together in society, and they're all absolutely necessary for us to be able to communicate with one another as well. If you don't have those things, because it's impossible to be like perfectly explicit. There's always all kinds of implicit patterns and implicit stuff that you have to assume. Otherwise, the other person is not going to be able to. That the other person is going to take it into account, right? When they're. It's interesting what you're saying about the East and the West. The more the spiritual, the form coming from above, and the material attention to multiplicity. That's a fascinating observation. Yes, the difference between the two, because it certainly is this tension between kind of pragmatism and mysticism.
And I'm not sure why there's something. The only other kind of connection I see maybe is there's something about the symbolism of the East and the West, where the East is where the sun rises, where let's say the meaning comes from, the sun, the patterns, whereas in the West, where the sun sets, where the dark, where there's the potential, let's say the multiplicity. So maybe there's something sort of cosmic there. It's the only other kind of explanation I have for it, because it's, if I look at the philosophy, it seems to be what happens, or even at the religions, like what has happened with religion in the West versus in the East. Because even today, with like the materialism that most people have, like other cultures would still qualify that as a kind of religion. Like we actually invented the separation between like politics and religion, or secular life and religious life. I think it's Augustine who sort of first defined it in the City of God, to distinguish what's going on in the secular, like in this age of the city of man, in distinction to what happens in the city of God, and both sort of grow up side by side. So I think Augustine invented that definition, but like it became sort of mainstream later in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we went to other cities in the East, let's say, or like when we found out other people, we like used that distinction and sort of pushed it on them.
Mm-hmm.
But for Hindus, there was no such thing as Hinduism. There was just like what they did. Like it was like the entire life was just like Hinduism, we say, but it was their religion, their politics, and what they did was the same kind of thing. So the like our modern Western religion is a kind of very low level materialistic kind of worship of quantity or of power, like things of a very low level material nature. Whereas in the East, it remained like higher and visible kind of mysticism. There are interesting things happening now where, because of like the interconnectedness of the modern world, where we're getting influenced both ways. So I'm not sure where this is going to go, but it looks like there really is the split where I see it in the philosophy, I see it in the religion, but it's hard to explain why, let's say, it happened this way.
Yeah. No, there's a Buddhism is very kind of non-worldly in many ways, right? You try to empty yourself completely, to detach yourself from everything. That's very, very different from the Western mentality, right? Where in fact, people are attaching themselves to material things like as much as possible.
Yeah.
Almost the opposite sort of. What was I was reading something. Was it by C.S. Lewis? I think it was, where he talked about two kinds of religions with respect to desire. Said there are religions. Well, you can kind of categorize all religions into two basic categories. One of them is anti-desire, so it's simply a negation of your desires. That's kind of like Buddhism, right, where you try to negate all of your attachments, all of your appetites towards material things. And he said there's other religions where it's the affirmation of your desires. So like in the temple of Aphrodite, like there were prostitutes, so you actually went there to have sex, right?
Yeah.
And in the temple of Bacchus, you got drunk, right? So it was an affirmation. And he said the Christianity is unique in that it's both, right? It tells you both. You have to negate some desires, and it affirms. So like the Christians both feast and fast. Right. And he says that's kind of unique in his opinion as to what's going on. So you kind of see the two, like what's happened with the fall of, or the decline of Christianity in the West is it's gone towards like affirming all of your desires. You just follow your desire for material things wherever it takes you. In the East, you have the strain which is negation of, so kind of negation of desire. But true Christianity is actually both, right? It's a more balanced sort of, very much more balanced sort of a thing.
It's the unity and the multiplicity. Like there's goodness in materiality and multiplicity and all of the material goods of life. Like these things are good, but they're also good in asceticism, in shedding off all that is peripheral and, let's say, just pure contemplative prayer. And Saint Maximus, I was reading something by Balthazar on Saint Maximus, and like he explains that Maximus played that role importantly, like to harmonize the East and the West for the Christian tradition as a whole. And he, like, I don't recall all the historical details because there were tons of political controversies at the time. It's why Saint Maximus was made confessor. He lost his tongue first because he spoke against the emperor was trying to impose something, He lost his tongue for it, and then lost his right hand for it, and then was exiled. But he did that to defend like really important Christological dogmas that like were really important for the entire church. So I mean, he was willing to do that because he was willing to lose like his tongue and his hand because it was so important. But like part of what he did was to negate some of the otherworldly, some of the, let's say, true unitive aspects of Eastern religion, because you had some figures, let's say like Origen and Evagrius and some of the like Eastern Christian thinkers who, let's say, saw the fall as something where human beings were purely spiritual and then became physical, or where sexuality itself was something that was part of the fall. And like there were a bunch of, let's say, emphases for unity against multiplicity that were present in the East, that Saint Maximus was able to moderate, was able to like negate some of the things he found in the East, but then keep the good, keep the mysticism, keep the fact that all of creation is drawn up towards God. Like he's able to keep, let's say, the good aspects of mysticism, while also preserving the goodness of multiplicity. That's really a Christian thing, the goodness of matter, and he does it with the incarnation, and also, I mean, Genesis, as we said, like you can see straight in Genesis that like the material things that God creates are good too. So Maximus is able to solve philosophical puzzles this way. The one and the many that we talked about earlier is able to solve, say, also moral puzzles that we also talked about, the goodness of creation, the goodness of matter, and it comes from, let's say, theological insights about the way that God interacts with the world.
I'll have to read Maximus. I've never read anything by him, which is matter is sort of an expression of the limitation of the created being in a certain sense, right? Matter, yeah, because it's much more limited, a form of being, and also being like conditional actuality kind of brings more to light that it's not pure actuality, right? It's not unconditioned actuality in many ways. It kind of brings out the creatureliness of creation. I don't know. more than form does. Maybe.
Then the creatureliness, the multiplicity, really, like the fact that it's spread out across time and space.
We also have multiplicity in the Trinity.
Yeah, that's true.
To a certain, limited to three, but this is like certainly in creation and material individuals. You have many more than three, right? I think. Bacteria, there's like several billion living in our own body at any one time. So there you have, you have something interesting to think about there too, right? As to exactly what that. But I don't know. I'm getting the impression like it brings out more than form does the fact that we are limited actuality, we're limited conditional actuality, rather than actual actuality or pure actuality. I don't know. There's something to be thought about there anyway.
I mean, at the end of the article, Schindler talks about the Trinity, and you raised that point earlier, but there's it's part of the answer to the puzzles we talked about earlier of how the one and the many can be good. It's that like Christianity sets that right up in God, and I don't recall if it's there that I saw Schindler write this, or maybe it was Balthazar I saw write this, but he says that in Christianity, God is the unity of both unity and difference, where like God is a productive kind of unity, where and in a position to, let's say, the more purely Greek kinds of philosophy we talked about earlier, where things come down from unity to multiplicity, and it's hard to explain why things would come down. In Christianity, we state that, well, God creates the multiplicity, creates the unity, and somehow brings them both together into Himself, and it's tied right up to the Trinity. The fact that somehow in God Himself we enshrine this goodness of unity and difference, and it's sort of, and it's super mysterious. Like you have to just take up that one, but like as we said earlier, I think there's like all the positions are gonna have some kind of mystery. So for the Greeks, let's say you start with the form of forms, but then you have like a real problem, not just a mystery, but a real problem of how can things come down with purely emergentist kind of modern worldviews. Then you can explain how things, let's say, I mean, you can't even really explain why things become more complex. Like you have this huge problem of like, how are the higher levels intelligible?
And what elicits the organization, right? Because if it's just like if it's just formless matter, or, unorganized matter, why should it organize itself, right? And I think that's a big problem, right?
Yeah. So it's if you take that mystery, if you're able to take the Trinity, then you can seemingly answer all of those puzzles. Unity and difference can be good. How God can create both unity and difference, because He is Himself both unity and difference. So what comes out of Him is both unity and difference. And the unity,
but it's more than that. It's difference in unity.
Yeah.
Like what we've been talking about the two sexes. It's not just difference. It's difference in unity.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's a real reflection of what the Trinity is, as much as we can understand what it is, right? It's like it's the two together, right? And you don't have one without the other, right? You have and I like him saying that's like when they say that God is love. In a way, that's what's being said, right? That there you have like real difference is not opposition, it's relationality. So it's unity at the same time as it's difference, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of paradoxical, but at the same time, I think it makes some sense, right? That like just what we were saying about you can't really define a difference unless you have some kind of unity, right? To start with, right?
You need a genus. You need something in common.
So as to even conceive of it, right? So it's not anti-rational, that right? It seems to be kind of super rational in some ways, right? But it's a very, very fruitful article. I mean, I've rarely read something that's made me think so much. There's so many different things as this, right? As to, it's a real, because there certainly must be, like if Revelation is true, and being, like the subsistent being itself is Trinitarian, I mean, that has to have consequences, like philosophical and metaphysical consequences, right? Because metaphysics is what the study of being is being. Well, if being is Trinitarian, well, that's going to have going to have consequences on the way that it manifests itself at all different levels, right? I know you just read on the Trinity by Saint Augustine. I don't know if you saw any things there where he. I started reading it. I haven't gotten too far yet. So.
I don't recall. It's been. I mean, it's still been a few months, and I recall mostly the end of the book, but I don't recall anything directly related to that. There's the thing that keeps coming back to my mind though is more about like some of the differences between Aquinas and Saint Maximus, because I think both share the fact that, let's say, the Christian emphasis on the Trinity allows you to explain both the goodness of unity and difference and how they can cohere together. I think they both have that. what I find puzzling, and also what would be cool to explore, because it's a difference, let's say, between Jonathan's position and the more mainstream Western position, that like the way that, let's say, this creation happens, this creation of unity and difference, how it's created and how it's resolved. For us in the West, there's no, let's say, we don't commit ourselves to exactly saying how these are, how these work, let's say, super concretely. But in the East, especially with Maximus says that ultimately, like, unity and difference are created and resolved in the incarnation. Sort of what I mentioned earlier. And this is, it's super mysterious, but I'd like to see if I can make some headway on that question. Yeah, as I said, I find it really difficult because, like, I think I can sort of give arguments for why, let's see, classically Christian metaphysics allows you to explain both difference and unity, which we see in the world. So, like, this framework of emergence and relation, I think it's good. I think we see it in Aquinas. I think that's solid. But like the further commitment to the fact that it's through the incarnation, that's what I wonder most about. Because, like, let's say Saint Maximus will use, let's say, the fact that somehow creation is distinct from God, but it also can't be totally distinct, because then it would be somehow independent. So the way that, and there's a few other puzzles like this where you have a difference but must somehow also have a union, that Maximus solves always by bringing up the incarnation, because that's what happens in Christ. Like, in one person you have the union of created and uncreated natures. So you have this possibility of a complete distinction of, like, two totally different natures, something limited and something unlimited. But at the same time, you also have the perfect union in one person. So you have an infinity of difference and, like, a direct connection. So because we know that this happens in one person, then Maximus sort of applies it across all of creation through that one person. So it's an interesting solution. But I don't know if I can give, let's say, extra arguments for it. Like, it seems to work conceptually, but yeah, I don't know if I can give extra arguments for it. It seems a bit fantastical almost. Like, it's super mystical. I could see, like, why. I mean, Saint Maximus was a monk in North Africa, I think, something like that. So it's, I mean, he had to be active for controversies and so on. But being a monk, I could see kind of how he could live that way. But for, let's say, modern Western people, it's so kind of hard to imagine that all of the world would really, like, exist and be resolved directly in the incarnation.
Yeah, no, it's very mysterious. I was reading something by a commentary of David Schindler on a book by a German philosopher, Ulrich, Homo Abyssus. And I didn't understand all that much, but one of the ideas that I got was how God has given, he's given himself so fully in creation that it actually has its own being. But of course that's dependent on God, but he's given it so much, in other words, the gift of being is so full that it's actually like it's subsistence, right? It has its own, which I found a fascinating idea as well, as to how, like, God is so unselfish, or so giving, that he gives totally, right? In other words, it's not like that it's subjugation or whatever. He's actually given over. But it seems to be a different line of thought from Maximus. I don't know if it's if the two can be reconciled.
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Which is, I mean, the idea of Ulrich is interesting. What it made me think, one of the things that made me think was like this kind of allows us to understand how it's not so difficult to be an atheist, right? Because like God is not like imposing himself or popping up everywhere, like in the sense the things have a certain subsistence, right? They have a certain independence. But it's only because God has wanted it to be that way. But this independence, in a way, is a sign of God's generosity, in that He doesn't want to control, He's given creation kind of over to itself to some degree.
Right? And also like a way to express the intelligibility of creation and of the relationship between God and creation, because I think if God was always sort of directly involved in creation, it would make God look like kind of a bad leader or a bad chef, someone who always has to intervene in all the little details because things are always going off the rails. Whereas if you had a supremely intelligent creator, like if the world was supremely intelligible, then what you'd see is that things make sense on their own. Like there is things lacking if you like keep within a certain layer, but things should be broadly intelligible if you keep at this level. Like a good leader doesn't need to always intervene.
Yeah. Another danger, I think, with the interventionist sort of God is pantheism, right? Where the distinction between God and creation tends to be obliterated, right? Whereas it's very clear in the Christian view that this creation is not God, right? It's at the same time it's dependent upon God, but it has its own being to some degree, but that's only because God has wanted it that way, right? Which is that's another line. I think that's another line of thought, right? I don't see the connection between that and what Maximus is pointing out about the incarnation.
I think
because in the incarnation you have like the one divine person who is operating through two different natures at the same time, which implies a close association between the human nature and the divine person, right? Because it's one of his natures, right? Whereas creation is not one of God's natures in that sense, right?
No, that's true.
I'm kind of arguing against Maximus here,
but say Maximus.
In other words, but I don't know how serious that should be taken.
But I mean, you won't say that. Let's say the union happens between the nature of creation and the nature of God at this level, but you will say that, let's say, the incarnate Christ is the head of all creation, and like through that, all of creation is united with God. So like there's this union that happens between.
That's kind of in the other direction, right? Coming back to God. Kind of the redemptive direction, right? Where you're bringing things back.
There's definitely that, But even creation, you would say, happens this way. Like ultimately for him, creation doesn't sort of happen 6,000 years ago, and then after a while, humans sin, and then like the crucifixion happens. Like for him, the incarnation is sort of the central summit of creation, from which both the past and the future unfold. So it's hard to think about, but let's say because he doesn't want to negate freedom, the fact that, let's say, humans fail, but at the same time, you'd say that maybe the incarnation didn't have to happen the way it did, like with all of the mess that it was, but at the same time, the incarnation was inevitable, and I think the way he kind of explains it is all of the, let's say, the essences of things, he calls them logoi, because they're not just abstract forms like for the Greeks. It's also like the principle of existence of everything, like not just their, let's say, unity coming down, but also their principle of individuation, you could say, like their individual, like unity of matter and form. He calls that the logoi of things. So the small logoi of the one logos, you could say. And like what he says is that all of the different logoi make up the logos. And the one logos is also the many logoi. But he doesn't want to be pantheistic about it. He maintains that there's a perfect difference and a perfect unity between them.
Difference in unity again.
Yeah, again. So like the unity and difference between God and creation, between the logos and creation, will happen through the union and difference of the logos and the logoi. So because of that, what was
In other words, creation can be brought back to God through the logoi of creation can be brought back to God through the logos,
yes,
the capital L. So
yes. Yeah. So that's the, and I think we actually, I don't know how. I think we probably agree with that. I'm not sure exactly if it was like maybe when in the incarnation. I don't know if it was the cross or the ascension. Like it's hard to say. Maybe it's the whole thing, but I think we can probably agree with that. That creation came back to God with the incarnation.
What Jesus said, "When I am lifted on high, I will bring all things to myself." Right?
Yeah. So it's probably the ascension. But conversely, Maximus would also say that it's by, let's say, the logos coming down that the logoi can also come down, like, from the uncreated into the created. So creation, it's not only, let's say, redemption or the return of things to God that happens through the incarnation, it's also their creation. It's like maybe one good image I've heard to describe it is kind of like when you, like a movie with a fishtail ending, where, let's say, all of the plot that you see throughout the movie is sort of a multiplicity of separate elements, but then when you see the key at the end of the movie, all of a sudden the whole movie sort of clears up, and like you can retroactively understand what happens. So the fact that a movie can all of a sudden, let's say, be created from the end by the meaning being revealed at the end, sort of creates things, I guess, backward in time. So the summit of the movie, let's say, was the ending, and it's what cleared up the beginning. So I've heard it as an image of also what Christ does in the incarnation. So it's like the logoi were given at the incarnation, as if, let's say, multiplicity or materiality was let's say there from, let's say, the beginning of time, but things weren't clear yet. Things didn't yet have their form, you could say, or their full individuality in the logos. You needed the incarnation for this to happen, let's say, from the summit down the mountain. So it's sort of how I've heard it explained, but I still find it mysterious, and I would like, let's say, extra arguments for it. I find it, let's say, attractive. It's interesting and it's cool, but I don't let's say I don't feel safe enough in it to commit.
Yeah. Well, I have to think about that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I go out on a limb, but break off and fall. But,
But this was fun. It was a good idea to record this. So thanks for
We'll
proposing
see
that.
how it comes out. Yeah.